Dust curled behind her like a trailing veil as she rode beneath the low-hung sky, the horses' hooves drumming a soft rhythm across the brittle plains. The wind carried a scent of juniper and old regrets. The woman wore no hat, only a loosely tied kerchief that fluttered against her neck. Her back was straight, her eyes forward, but something in the set of her jaw betrayed the weight she carried. In her saddlebag, tucked beneath a worn wool shawl, was a small cedar box with hinges rusted by saltwater tears. She reached the town just as the sun dipped behind the butte. It was the kind of place built more by endurance than design: 3 crooked rows of buildings, a leaning church steeple, a general store with the R fallen from its sign. The saloon buzzed softly with the laughter of men too tired to be cruel, but still careless with their words. Children played barefoot in the dirt. One of them, a little boy with a swollen eye, stared as she passed. She gave him a slow nod. He did not return it. No one asked her name, and she offered none. At the livery, she left her horse with a quiet nod to the stable boy. At the inn, she rented a room with coins scraped from the corners of too many maps. She took only a basin and a match from the keeper, then stepped into the dusk, carrying the cedar box in her hands like something still alive. Beyond town, she found a grove of cottonwoods by the dry creek bed. The earth there was cracked but soft. She knelt, her skirt pooling around her, and began to dig with her bare hands. Dust clung to her fingers, and blood rose beneath her nails. She didn't stop until the hole was deep enough to hold what she had carried across 3 states and 5 winters. She placed the box inside as if it might wait. Then she covered it again, slowly, methodically, patting the soil flat with her palms. The last light touched her face as she stood, brushing the dirt from her skirt. Her eyes were dry, but her shoulders trembled once, just once. The next morning, she entered town not as a stranger but as a woman with purpose. She inquired at the bakery, where the old couple who owned it squinted at her like they'd seen a ghost in broad daylight. She told them she could bake, clean, and keep quiet. That last part seemed to comfort them most. They gave her a job on trial, sweeping floors and keeping to the back. Each morning, she worked before dawn, flour dusting her sleeves, hands red from scrubbing pans no one else touched. She never spoke unless spoken to. She fed the stray cat behind the shop, helped the blind widow across the street, and left each day without a sound. But slowly, the town began to take notice. Not of who she was, only that she was. The mystery of her became part of the wind, something whispered in passing but never dared aloud. At the edge of town, she rented a small cabin with slanted walls and a roof patched with tar paper. It smelled of tobacco and damp wood. She cleaned it until it didn't. Her first act was to plant wildflowers near the spot where the box now slept beneath the cottonwood. Bluebonnets, if the seed took. One evening, as she left the bakery, the sheriff's son leaned against the porch post, arms crossed and eyes sharp. He was a tall man, square-jawed, with the kind of smile that never reached his eyes. Folks said he was headed for politics, or trouble, depending on which way the wind blew. He tipped his hat. "New in town?" She nodded. "You from the east?" She looked past him. "Farther. You always this friendly?" "I'm not here for friends." He chuckled, as if her resistance were a challenge rather than a warning. "Well, if you change your mind, I'll be around." She kept walking. He watched her go, his smile thinning. Later that night, the woman next door knocked gently on her cabin door. She was old, with white hair braided down her back and knuckles like twisted root. She held out a pie. "You're too thin," she said, voice rough like worn leather. "And the wind's been mean lately. Eats right through folks who don't anchor their souls." The younger woman accepted the pie with a nod. The old woman didn't ask her name. "Instead," she said, "sometimes the things we bury don't stay gone. Sometimes they grow wild. Be careful where you plant your sorrow." The younger woman didn't answer, but she kept the pie. By the second week, the children had stopped staring. One of them, a deaf girl with tangled hair and bright, watchful eyes, began lingering near the bakery's back door in the early mornings. The woman began leaving out an extra biscuit each day, placed carefully beside the milk crate. The girl never took it while she watched, but it was always gone when she returned. The stable hand was the last to notice her. He lived near the river bend, in a low cabin built with his own hands. A man of few words, he walked with a limp from a bullet he never spoke of. Most said he wasn't right in the head since the war, but those who knew better just said he'd seen too much and come back with too little. She first saw him at the market, trading 2 rabbits for coffee and salt. He moved slowly but with purpose, like someone who no longer rushed for anything. Their eyes met once. He looked away first. It was not shame nor fear, just a quiet respect for boundaries not yet spoken. The town was patient with her silence, but not gentle. People don't always need to be cruel to be unkind. They simply fill gaps with stories, and her gaps were many. Some said she was a widow. Others swore she was a runaway bride, or worse. But the truth held itself deep in her chest, tucked behind ribs that no longer trusted breath. Still, there were moments, small ones, that softened her. A child offering her a wilted flower. The old woman nodding at her in the market. The deaf girl signing something she couldn't understand but smiled at anyway. And once, just once, in the quiet between dusk and full dark, she stood at the edge of her small yard, staring at the soil that now held her past. Her hands were folded in front of her, sleeves rolled. The air smelled like rain, though none had fallen. A soft wind stirred the loose strands of her hair. From the road, the stable hand passed by on foot. He paused, looked at the tilled earth beside her cabin, and said only this: "Hard to grow much in soil that dry." She looked at him, then the earth. "Still," he added, "sometimes things take root anyway." She didn't answer. But she watched him until he disappeared down the path, his limp fading into the hush of night. Inside, she sat down with a cup of water and the last slice of the old woman's pie. It had gone stale, but she ate it slowly, watching the moon rise through the cracked window. Something in her chest shifted. Not healed, no. But perhaps, for the first time in years, something had begun to stir beneath the ashes. And far off, unseen by any eye, the wind blew through the cottonwoods and over the grave that was not a grave, only a place where pain had finally been given back to the earth. It was a wounded bird that brought her to him. Not fate, not coincidence, just a flicker of fragile life on the side of the road, wings splayed and chest heaving in the dust. She had passed it on her way back from town, basket of stale bread balanced on her hip. She'd meant to walk past it, meant to keep her world small and untouched. But it blinked, and that blink, trembling, desperate, was more than she could ignore. She wrapped it in her kerchief and turned off the path, following a narrow trail that curled down toward the river. The wind changed there, cooler, laced with moisture and the scent of willow bark. A wooden cabin stood at the bend, low and weathered, with a garden of wild mint and broken tools. He was sitting by the porch, repairing a fence post with his back to her, his hands moving slow and sure. She cleared her throat softly. He didn't startle, just paused and looked over his shoulder. His face was lean, shadowed by sun and silence, and his eyes, pale green, studied her without demand. She held out the bird. He stood without a word, wiped his hands on his trousers, and took it from her as gently as if it were made of spun glass. He examined it carefully, cradled it like memory, then nodded once and disappeared into his home. She didn't follow. She only waited. When he returned, the bird was nestled in a small wooden box lined with cotton. He set it on a table outside the cabin and gestured toward it. She understood, he'd done all he could. Whether it lived was no longer his to decide. "Thank you," she said. He nodded again. She lingered for a moment, then turned and left, the smell of mint clinging to her boot. From then on, she found herself passing that trail more often. Sometimes with a reason, eggs from the market, herbs she didn't need. Other times with none. He was usually outside, chopping wood, feeding chickens, mending things that barely held together. He never asked her why she came. She never asked his name. They shared silence like some share stories, quiet, unrushed, with pauses that said more than words could carry. Occasionally, he'd offer her a stool. She'd sit for a minute or two, then leave again. It was enough. One morning, she arrived with a small bundle, 2 slices of rye and a sliver of cheese. He took it without comment, placed it on the table, and handed her a tin cup of well water in return. They sat, both watching the bird, still alive, now hopping awkwardly in its wooden sanctuary. She smiled, just barely. He said, finally, "Didn't expect it to last." She didn't look at him. Neither did I. From then on, they spoke in fragments, never about the past, never about the town. She learned he had once been a blacksmith. Before the war took part of his leg, and something else deeper, more invisible. He never said what. She didn't need him to. The town's rumors eventually followed her to the river, though he didn't bring them. Others did. Voices carried on wind, whispered warnings that the woman with the haunted eyes was hiding something dangerous. But he never repeated them. If he knew, he never let it change the way he looked at her. Once, while helping him stack firewood, her sleeve pulled back to reveal the thin white scar across her wrist. She saw his eyes fall on it. He said nothing, only passed her the next log. She did not flinch. Neither did he. The deaf girl started visiting her more often. No words, just presence. She'd arrive at the bakery before dawn, stand near the stove, and smile. The woman would hand her a roll without meeting her gaze, and the girl would vanish like a ghost with warm hands. One morning, the girl tugged her sleeve and motioned a simple sign. The woman did not know what it meant, but she memorized it anyway. The sheriff's son was not fond of this. He watched her from across the street sometimes, hat tilted low, boots polished and grin sharpened. Once, he followed her partway home, making sure she saw him. She didn't stop, didn't look back. But her fingers curled around the knife in her apron pocket until she reached her door. Later that week, she sat beside the quiet man by the river, picking burrs from her skirt. He glanced at her hand. "You all right?" She didn't lie. "Someone followed me." He didn't ask who. He only nodded and stood, walking to the edge of his property. There, he began placing a series of small bells on posts, stringing thin wire from tree to tree. He didn't explain. She didn't need him to. A few nights later, the bells rang. Nothing came of it, but she watched from her window and saw him standing in the dark with a lantern, scanning the trees. After that, she slept easier. One afternoon, as the heat broke and the sky turned honeygold, he handed her a carved block of wood. At first, she didn't understand. Then she saw what it was: a bird, wings folded, perched on a branch. The lines were rough but patient. She held it in both hands for a long moment. "It's beautiful," she said softly. He gave a single shrug. "Thought the one we saved might want company." She smiled then, not politely, not faintly, but like something inside her had found its own name again. That evening, they sat on the porch as the sun dipped behind the river. The bird had flown days ago, and its box now held dried lavender. She told him a little, not much. Just that there had been a girl, and then there hadn't. He didn't press. He only looked at the horizon and said, "Some things break so we know what not to take for granted." She nodded, the words folding into her. In town, the air had started to shift. The old woman who gave her pie began to stop by the bakery more often. The children stopped crossing the street when they saw her coming. The deaf girl had started bringing her flowers. But not everyone softened. The sheriff's son still stared too long. He still spoke too loud, laughed too hard when she passed. Something about him said he'd wait as long as it took for her to trip. One morning, she arrived at the bakery to find a dead crow nailed to the door. She removed it without a word. Cleaned the blood. Opened the shop. When she told the quiet man, he didn't say anything. But the next day, she saw him at the general store buying extra nails, new hinges, a second lock. That evening, he walked her home without asking. As they reached her cabin, he paused. I could build you a gate. You don't have to. I know. She nodded. He came the next day with tools and timber. He worked all morning, barely speaking, only stopping to sip the tea she brought. When it was finished, it wasn't just a gate, it was a fence, strong and tall, with a latch that clicked like a promise. She traced the wood with her fingers. Why? He looked at her, not smiling, just steady. Because sometimes walls don't mean keeping people out. Sometimes they mean letting yourself feel safe inside. She stood quiet a moment, then whispered, "Thank you." As he turned to leave, she said softly, "What's your name?" He paused. "Elias." She whispered it once, like a word she wasn't sure she deserved. Then she watched him go, and for the first time in a long time, she realized she had not thought of leaving all day. Summer deepened, and the sky turned the color of scorched bone. The wildflowers by the cottonwoods had begun to bloom, late but bright, tiny specks of defiance in a place built by surrender. She watered them each morning with a tin pail, never stepping too close to the patch of earth she once disturbed. Some memories had teeth. Others grew root. Elias had become part of her world the way dusk becomes part of day, not sudden, not loud, just inevitable. He arrived sometimes with small repairs she hadn't asked for, or sat silently while she kneaded bread on the porch. Their connection unfolded slowly, wordlessly, like steam rising from tea. A quiet understanding passed between them that spoke of more than comfort, it spoke of recognition. Of knowing what it meant to lose without letting go. In town, people began to take note. Not just of her, but of him. It was the way he stood when she passed, a little nearer than needed. The way he spoke to her with a softened voice no one else ever heard. The sheriff's son noticed too. His glances sharpened. His words, once sly, turned sour. One evening, Elias walked her home beneath a sky strung with stars. He didn't speak, just walked with that steady limp, keeping pace. As they neared her cabin, she slowed. "They're watching," she said. "I know. They think I'm hiding something." "You are," he said, not accusing. "So am I." She looked at him, her breath held in her chest. He went on, eyes on the gate he'd built. "There's no sin in surviving. Not even in the shape it leaves you." She looked down at her hands. They were calloused now, dusted with flour, lined with soft scars that had no name. "But what if it comes back?" He met her gaze then, steady and still. "Then we face it together." It wasn't a vow. It wasn't a confession. It was a truth passed from one bruised soul to another. And for the first time, she didn't feel like a ghost pressing against glass. But peace has a way of waking the wolves. A week later, the bakery door was found ajar. Nothing stolen, but the shelves overturned. Sacks of flour ripped open like entrails. The deaf girl had come to help sweep and had stood in the wreckage, eyes wide, hands trembling. She calmed the girl, pressed a warm roll into her hand, and sent her home early. Then she swept in silence, the dust thick in her lungs, the floorboards groaning beneath her as if echoing something broken. Elias came by later, saw the ruin, and said nothing. Just rolled up his sleeves and helped clean. She watched his hands as they moved, steady, strong, the kind of hands that knew both fire and forgiveness. By nightfall, the bakery looked whole again. But they both knew what had been disturbed couldn't be swept away. The next morning, a note was pinned to her cabin door. No name. Just 3 words, carved in sharp strokes. "Graves don't keep." Her breath caught in her throat. She stared at the words as if they might rewrite themselves. Her first instinct was to burn it, to erase the message and pretend the past wasn't clawing its way back. But she didn't. She folded it instead, tucked it into the cedar box beneath her bed, the one she kept empty since burying the other. Later that week, she walked to the river alone. Elias wasn't there. She sat by the old bird box, now overgrown with time, and let the silence settle over her. She hadn't cried in years, not since the night the fire took everything she hadn't managed to run from. The man she had once married had been charm wearing a mask. His voice had been soft at first, his promises softer. But cruelty doesn't always start loud, it often begins in whispers. A broken glass, a locked door, a bruised wrist hidden by sleeves. She'd run the night he tried to bury the baby too. Her baby! His rage lit the house like dry pine. She hadn't looked back. She'd buried the ashes and the name. Carried it west until there was no further to go. But evil doesn't stay where you leave it. It follows. It waits. That night, Elias came to her door. His eyes were harder than she'd ever seen them. In his hand was a letter. "It's from Blackridge," he said. Her stomach turned. Blackridge was where it ended, and where it began. "They say a man's been asking for you. Asking about a woman who disappeared after a fire. Says he's her kin." She went cold. Her hands fell to her sides. "He's not," she whispered. "He's what I ran from." Elias said nothing for a long moment. Then, slowly, he sat beside her, folding the letter. His voice, when he spoke, was low. "You have a choice." "No, I don't." "You do," he said gently. "You can keep running. Or you can stop." She stared at the floor. "He'll ruin everything." "He already tried. But you're still here." The next morning, she found the old widow from town waiting at her door. The woman said nothing, just handed her a folded shawl. Inside it was a pistol. "I was married to a man like him once," the widow said, her voice frayed like old lace. "Didn't shoot him. Should've. But maybe it's not too late for someone." The bakery kept its doors closed for 2 days after that. She spent the time writing letters. One to the deaf girl, another to the old woman, a third to Elias. She didn't give them, just kept them in her apron pocket like anchors. On the third day, she walked into town with her head high. The sheriff's son leaned against a post, watching her approach. His smirk was wider now, like he knew something the world hadn't caught up to. "He's coming," he said. "Reckon you'll be gone by then?" She didn't stop. "I'm not the one who'll be running." His grin faltered. "You think Elias'll protect you?" She turned. "No," she said quietly. "But I'll protect myself." That night the wind changed. There was a sound like thunder in the distance. A wagon approaching fast. She stood on her porch, eyes fixed on the horizon. In her pocket was the pistol. In her hands, the letter she hadn't yet given to Elias. But before the wagon reached town, it broke an axle at the ridge. No one rode in that night. No stranger entered the saloon. She stayed up till dawn anyway, watching the stars blink like old friends. Elias found her there, just as the light broke. He didn't speak. He just sat, leaned against the post beside her, and handed her a mug of tea. The letter she'd written to him remained unread in her lap. "I'm not going," she said. "I know. Even if he comes." He nodded. "I'll be here." For a moment, the whole world seemed to hush. She looked out across the wildflowers, now open to the rising sun. They were blooming, every one. The days stretched long beneath the prairie sun, and the soil beneath her cabin bloomed with green, the kind of green that only grows where there was once fire. She worked in silence, flower on her hands, the soft hum of bees in the mint outside her window. Each movement became prayer. Each loaf she baked a small act of defiance, of healing. Still, shadows do not vanish when ignored. They lengthen. The sheriff's son had grown quiet. No more words thrown like stones in the street. No more smirks when she passed. But silence from a cruel man was never safety. It was a coiling, like a snake before the strike. She kept the widow's pistol near the register now, hidden beneath a folded cloth. Elias knew. He had noticed, but never asked. He just made sure the lock on the bakery's back door clicked shut each night. The townsfolk had begun to shift, in small ways. A child left a flower on her windowsill. The postman lingered longer than necessary to chat about the weather. Even the widow stayed after buying bread, offering tales of her youth with a rasping laugh that softened the walls between them. Trust, like the seasons, had taken root, slow and unsure but persistent. It was a Thursday when the letter came, folded crisp, sealed with a smear of wax that smelled faintly of pine smoke. Coming to collect what's mine. You'll burn this time, asterisk asterisk. There was no name, but it didn't need one. She read it at the table, Elias sitting across from her. His hand didn't reach for hers. He knew better than to offer what couldn't yet be accepted, but his presence was steady, like timber sunk deep into earth. "What will you do?" he asked quietly. Her voice was even. "Stay. You don't have to prove anything." "I'm not staying to prove." She looked up, her eyes clear. "I'm staying because I belong." He studied her for a moment, then nodded once. That evening, she sat on her porch and wrote a final letter. Not one to be given. Just something to lay it all down. She didn't weep. There were no tears left for that part of her. But her breath came slow and deep, as if she were finally drawing from a well untouched for years. The next day brought a storm. The clouds gathered at noon, dark and swollen, rolling over the plains like judgment. Rain came hard, drumming the roof in bursts. She kept the bakery closed, candles lit inside. Elias came by soaked through, his coat heavy with water. "There's a wagon down at the edge of town," he said, brushing his hair back. "2 horses. 1 man." She didn't ask. She only rose, walked to the cupboard, and pulled out the box beneath the shelf. Inside was the letter, the pistol, and a small strip of cloth scorched at the edges, the only thing she'd kept from the fire. He stood by the window, watching the rain. "Whatever happens, you don't stand alone." "I know," she whispered. She tied the cloth around her wrist like a ribbon. As night fell, the town seemed to hold its breath. The streets emptied. Doors latched. The storm had paused but left behind a heavy silence, thick as molasses. She waited at the bakery's front window, lantern glowing beside her. The knock came just after midnight. Not timid. Not rushed. Just 3 heavy raps. She opened the door slowly. He stood there, older than she remembered, face worn but still sharp. Same cold eyes. Same twisted smile. "Told you graves don't keep," he muttered. Her voice did not tremble. "You came a long way to prove something." "I came to collect." She stood firm in the doorway. "There's nothing here for you." He laughed, dry and mean. "Everything here is mine. You. The story you stole. That name buried in ash." She stepped back. Not in fear, just space. For truth. For the air between them to fill with everything unsaid. "You lost the right to that story the night you locked the door and lit the fire." He smirked. "They'll believe me. A lawman already does. I'm not afraid of what people believe anymore." There was a shuffle behind her, Elias stepping forward. The man's eyes narrowed. "This him? Your savior?" Elias didn't speak. He didn't need to. She reached down, placed the pistol on the counter. Not pointed. Not raised. Just there. "Leave," she said. He stepped closer. "And if I don't?" It was Elias who answered then, voice calm as a still lake. "Then you'll see what it means to lose everything twice." The man's eyes darted between them, weighing the risk. The rain had begun again, just a whisper now, but constant. He leaned in, his breath sour. "You'll never bury me deep enough." She met his gaze. "No. But I've buried who I used to be. And she's not rising to greet you." Then, as if the moment itself broke, the man stepped back. Just a few paces. But it was enough. He turned. The door slammed. They listened to his boots fade into the rain. She didn't cry. Didn't shake. She only walked to the door, closed it, and turned the lock. Elias stayed a while longer, quiet as ever. When he left, he touched her hand briefly, just a brush of fingers. "You were never the one who needed protecting," he said. That night, she slept without the pistol beneath her pillow. The next morning, the rain had washed the dust from every surface in town. The air smelled clean, like sage and new beginnings. When she opened the bakery, the first customer was the deaf girl. She brought a flower, wild, yellow, bold. The woman placed it in a jar by the window. By midday, the shelves were nearly empty. People came and stayed longer. They smiled more easily. No one asked about the man who had ridden in and left again. Only Elias returned near closing, bringing a scrap of cedar and a carving knife. "Thought the bird might need a friend," he said. She smiled softly. "No," she said. "She's got a whole sky now." And for the first time she felt it, not just safety, not just silence, but peace. The kind that doesn't ask for permission. The kind that rises from the grave and blooms. The sun crept low across the plains, casting long shadows that rippled like silk over the tall grasses. The town stirred gently as if waking from a long-held breath. Birds sang with a clearer voice that morning, and the wind moved soft through the cottonwoods, no longer carrying warnings but lullabies. She stood at the bakery window, hands resting lightly on the worn sill, eyes on the horizon where gold and indigo met in a tender embrace. Word had spread, not by mouths but by silence, that the man who once haunted her had come and left. No blood was spilled. No law was summoned. But something permanent had shifted. It was in the way folks nodded to her now. Not cautious, not curious, just warm. Like they finally saw her not as a mystery but as a neighbor. The pistol had been returned to the cedar box. The letters, all but one, burned behind the bakery in a quiet fire. Only the letter to Elias remained, its edges softened by her handling. She still hadn't given it to him, but it had stopped feeling like a shield. It felt like a seed now, something waiting to be planted, if ever the moment was right. She didn't see him again, not the man who had tried to drag her past back into the light. Some said he'd been run out of another town not far off. Others said he met a rough end somewhere near the canyons, where the rocks forget names and time. But she never asked. She never needed to. Some graves dig themselves. Some endings come without the weight of justice but with the gift of silence. Elias came by more often now. Not every day, not always with words. Sometimes just with his presence, his steadiness. He'd bring what he'd carved or wild herbs from the riverbend. She began to learn the shape of his footsteps, the rhythm of his breath when he slept on the porch after long days helping the widow repair her roof. She no longer wondered when he'd leave. He didn't belong to the town or to her. He belonged to the peace between them, and that was enough. They never spoke of love, not in words. But it bloomed in gestures, in the way he sliced apples and left them peeled just the way she liked. In the way her hand would brush his as they worked side by side, neither pulling away. One night, as fireflies danced in the tall grass, she leaned into him just enough for her shoulder to rest against his. He didn't move, didn't breathe too loud. Just let the stillness between them grow into something whole. Summer leaned into fall, and the days grew shorter. The trees whispered of change, their leaves crisping at the edges. She began baking with cinnamon again, filling the street with the scent of memory. The deaf girl had grown bolder, helping shape dough and draw little chalk hearts on the front steps each morning. The old widow began teaching her the piano with fingers that still remembered lullabies, even if they trembled. There was still pain. Grief doesn't vanish, it settles. It becomes something you carry in your bones, not your hand. But now, it lived beside joy. Now, the ache was a thread in the tapestry, not a tear through the middle. One evening, the town gathered near the chapel for a harvest gathering. Lanterns hung from branches, casting golden circles across faces warmed by cider and laughter. Children darted between hay bales. Someone played a fiddle, slow and sweet. She sat beside Elias on a bench, her apron dusted with flour and honey. As the music drifted into a hush, the mayor stood and cleared his throat. "We've weathered much this year," he said, eyes glancing at her, not unkindly. "Loss, change, and healing. Some of us arrived here with nothing but scars. And some of us stitched our names into this land with quiet grace." He paused, voice thick with feeling. "Tonight we honor not just the season, but the souls who chose to stay. Who built something sacred with nothing but their hands and hope." People clapped, slow and soft at first. Then louder. She didn't smile. Not outwardly. But inside, she felt something settle. Not pride, something older. Like roots finally reaching water. Later, as the crowd thinned and stars brightened overhead, Elias walked her home. The silence between them was soft, not strained. She paused at her porch, fingers brushing the doorframe. "I've been meaning to give you something," she said. He turned, patient. She reached into her apron, pulled out the folded letter. For a moment, she hesitated. But then she placed it in his hand, closing his fingers gently around it. He didn't open it. Just looked at her, his gaze deep and steady. "I don't need to read it to know what it means." "I know," she said. "But I need to say it." "Then I'll carry it," he replied. She nodded, stepping back as he walked off into the twilight. Inside, the cabin smelled of cedar and rising bread. She lit a candle, its flame small but certain. In that glow, she no longer looked like a woman who had fled from fire. She looked like a woman who had risen through it. Time passed, not in weeks but in seasons. Elias began building a cabin near the ridge. Not too close. Just near enough that their paths could cross with ease. The townsfolk said nothing, but many smiled when they saw him carrying planks through the trees. One morning, the widow came into the bakery and left behind a quilt folded neatly on the counter. "For the next porch," she said, voice cracking. She spent more time at the river these days, planting herbs in the soil where the birdhouse once stood. The earth was good there, rich and forgiving, like it knew what had been lost, and promised not to take again. Some nights, she and Elias sat by the fire outside, speaking of nothing and everything. Once, he asked her what she would have named the child, had things been different. "Rose," she said softly, "because she bloomed even in the ash." He nodded. No more questions. Just silence and the warmth of knowing. In the end, there was no dramatic finale. No final showdown or fiery justice. Just two people choosing to stay. Choosing to heal. Choosing each other. And maybe that was the real kind of victory. The kind no one else would ever carve into stone or write in ledgers. The kind that lived in fresh bread and quiet mornings and the soft hush of wind through tall grass. She buried her past, yes. But what rose from the grave wasn't ruin. It was her. And the whole frontier, whether they realized it or not, would never be the same.